Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist Polly Dunbar and the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards. Welcome, good to see you. So let's take a look, shall we, at the front pages. And the Eye is leading on the celebrations in Zimbabwe after Robert Mugabe finally resigns. The Metro also leads on that story, describing how crowds poured onto the streets when they heard the news. Likewise, The Times, which says the whole country is ecstatic that Mugabe has gone. The Guardian, too, pictures the celebrations on the streets of Harare as the news swept the nation. The FT says British and EU negotiators are aiming to reach a deal on the Brexit divorce bill by the middle of December. The Telegraph says Theresa May and Philip Hammond are at loggerheads over tomorrow's budget. It's criminal, says The Mirror, with an exclusive claiming that Theresa May said police budgets were safe and then cut them. The Daily Mail leads on the Bank of England's advising savers to boycott banks which haven't passed on the recent rise in interest rates. The Express has another of its medical lead stories, this time revealing that taking extra vitamin D is good for arthritis. While The Star has I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, a story about the boxer Amir Khan and a snake. Interesting. Polly Dunbar and Steve Richards are here. So Zimbabwe, not surprising, dominating many of the newspapers, including The Times, The Telegraph and so on. Zimbabwe ecstatic, The Times tells us, as Mugabe admits defeat, finally going. And really quite euphoric scenes we saw in Harare.
Yeah, in a way, this is the easiest phase of the story to report, the unequivocal joy as a tyrant falls. And when news of this, I mean, he's been sort of almost falling for the last few days. So when it happens, there is this great sense of euphoric excitement conveyed on virtually every front page, I think. We've been looking at them of tomorrow's papers. The difficult bit begins after the euphoria as to what happens next, but this is worth pausing and reflecting on the fall of a tyrant, and that's what they're all doing today.
Exactly. 37 years we heard from people today who had never known another leader, and that in itself is an example of what he was like, rigging elections now for a number of years, and these people are hoping for a better future, aren't they?
Yes, I think the mood is incredibly hopeful at the moment. Everybody quoted and everybody that has been spoken to on TV today has talked about their sense of jubilation, and when asked if they were worried about the future, they've all said no, now's not a time to worry about that, now's the time just to celebrate what's happened. And they're not thinking about tomorrow, they're thinking about today.
Yeah, and the pictures, as you can see, all over the newspapers, more scenes there. Jubilation on the street marks the end of the Mugabe era. Mugabe go home and rest. That's a big question, isn't it, I suppose? What happens to him now? Will he leave the country? Will he be allowed to rest in peace, as the long-standing opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai was saying perhaps he should be to do? Said today that he should be allowed to do.
Yeah, apparently he is likely to leave the country tonight, but obviously there's a massive question mark over what happens to Grace, his wife, because the military are calling for her to be prosecuted, and that obviously remains to be seen, what will happen to her.
What happens to him is part of the awkward choreography that follows. He now becomes a symbol in terms of how they are dealing with the future, and he's one element of it, a complicated one. He's still alive and has a voice, so to speak. So he is part of the complicated equation of what happens next. I suspect not the least complicated, because he is gone and he's not coming back.
And he's 93.
And is he 93?
And he has no supporting power base now. So in that sense, does he pose a danger?
No.
In that sense, it's over. But I'm not an expert on Zimbabwe. I don't think either of us are. We can't pretend to be.
No.
But following the choreography of these things, when dictators fall, everyone's united against the dictator. Then what follows, including what happens to the dictator if he or she is still alive, becomes incredibly highly charged and complicated. But as I say, I think that's probably one of the less complex issues as to what happens next.
So what happens next is the crocodile going to take power? Emmanuel Mnangagwa, the man who was sacked, the vice president, the man perhaps who prompted all of this, the great enforcer of Mugabe, and will he allow free and fair elections in the future? Those are the sort of second stage of these that become much more complicated, as you're suggesting.
Well, apparently he will take power tomorrow. So it's happening straight away. He obviously is feared in a similar way because he was known as the henchman of Mugabe. But it's also understood that he is more probably more reforming when it comes to the economic situation of Zimbabwe. So there's a sense in which he might be better for the country in that regard.
And people instantly will be looking out for gestures from him, for example, in compensation for lands that were taken, not necessarily the land back, but certainly maybe financial recompense for what happened to him. What can he do to assuage the West, who needs to perhaps invest in this? Well,
you've heard from Boris Johnson what he assumes and wants to happen, which is elections. Multi-party elections. But I think most of the papers tonight, are rightly concentrating on the fall because in a way the news cycle is very interesting. The last few days there's been a lot of speculation about what will happen next, whether there will be free elections, whether they will be multi-party elections, etc. But then Mugabe popped up and hadn't gone. Now he has, and I think the focus tonight at least is on the record, the fall, what it represents, what it means. And tomorrow we will find out more about the future. A little more, I suspect, not a great deal more.
It's an incredibly historic moment, 37 years. So, I can understand the celebrations.
So there's the eye as well. Zimbabwe rejoices, and even the picture on the front page of the Financial Times as well. The scenes up the top
photos.
there, that's inside Parliament, isn't it? As the Speaker read out the resignation letter. Some brilliant, moments in time, I suppose you'd describe that, wouldn't you, as you put it, historic.
And it's great political euphoria being captured in these photos. I mean, who knows whether it will turn to deep disillusion, but at the moment, that is uninhibited excitement about a political development. And it's compelling.
We'll get more on that, of course, at 11:30. More of the inside pages on this as well. But I'm going to turn to the budget now. Big moment, of course, for Chancellor Philip Hammond. Big moment for all of us to try and find out what is in the budget. And if you take a look at the lead story for the Telegraph, you might have the impression that not a lot is in this budget. What's this story about?
Well, this story is about the way the build-up to the budget has been framed. And it reflects unquestionable tensions between Number 10 and the Treasury. They are often there. They are unquestionably there in the build-up to this budget. But it is just about the build-up. It's the way the budget has been presented. And there's a classic quote from an unnamed, I think, minister in that piece saying, "This has been the most disastrous budget build-up ever." Well, that would be more damning if it becomes the most disastrous budget ever. But on the whole, the build-up to these things tend to be forgotten when the budget is delivered. So the test for Hammond is tomorrow and the aftermath rather than the build-up. The fact that he's being slagged off in the build-up is a reflection of all kinds of internal tensions about Brexit, his own lack of antennae about framing narratives, which more political chancellors do in advance of a budget, during it and afterwards. But the test of all chancellors is the budget and afterwards. More clever political chancellors have fallen when they've delivered the thing. So the test is tomorrow.
The suggestion in this article is that education measures which have been announced to the media needed to be inserted. Mr Hammond setting out, we were told this evening, a £177 million plan to give schools and sixth forms £600 for every additional student who takes A-level maths. That's not going to make the front page of The Sun, is it? Let's be honest about it.
No.
You know, a £42 million fund to support £1,000 of training for every teachers in selected schools in areas that have fallen behind. these are not groundbreaking measures we might anticipate
No,
tomorrow.
I mean, there's a real sense, and obviously we don't know if he might pull a rabbit out of the hat at the last minute. But
We all hope so.
there's a real sense, certainly at the moment, that it's not going to be a very exciting budget. It's not going to be a budget with loads of giveaways. And obviously, I'm sure we'll come on to Brexit later, but it's very unfortunate timing for Hammond because it's happening in the week that the payments to the EU have been doubled, we think, to 40 billion. And I think there are a lot of people in the country,
You put two and two together and say that's a lot of money for the EU.
Exactly, and there doesn't seem to be very much money for schools or for the NHS or as much money for house building as certainly some people like Sajid Javid are saying we need. Yet somehow you can find 40 billion down the back of the sofa to pay for Brexit.
He is in such a constrained place.
Yeah.
Is this the Guardian story as well, then? Is that,
they've actually put it on the front page,
down the bottom
column
now.
from
I'll bring
Larry
it up a
Elliott,
bit.
their economics columnist, who basically, the trickiest budget in a generation. And he is absolutely right in the sense that he's delivering it in a hung parliament. They haven't got an overall majority. Brexit looms, as we've been discussing.
They haven't got any money.
And
Deficit figures worse today than anticipated.
So he is incredibly constrained. And it's not just, what do we want to do? So, which is why I'm surprised he's allowed the framing it to be this has got to be a game changer. Because he and Number 10 must have asked of every measure, can we get this through this House of Commons? Because do you remember a year ago he got defeated, not in March, on his budget. They had an overall majority then on his tax rise.
This is for national insurance.
National insurance,
self-employed.
Yeah, that was before the election. They still had a majority, and he had to withdraw it within a week. Now, he won't want something like that this time in the context of a vulnerable government. He himself has become personally vulnerable because he's got enemies all over the place. And so he is incredibly constrained in the same way that governments in the 70s in hung parliaments and economic crises couldn't do game-changing budgets because they just didn't have the political space. Actually, not many budgets are game-changing, and I'd be surprised if this is.
Well, still worth watching, don't you think?
Oh, of
Full
course.
coverage tomorrow afternoon, of course.
Of course.
Still to come, the desperate steps that some children are resorting to access mental health care. Back with that in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me this evening, the journalist Polly Dunbar and the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards. Welcome back to you. Daily Mail just in, as you can see, boycott the greedy banks. They're suggesting that only 1 in 7 savings accounts have passed on that rate rise to millions of savers. And we, the consumer, the saver, should avoid them. What do you think?
I think it's based, isn't it, on a quote from the Deputy
Governor of the
Bank of England. I mean, one of the big issues, certainly we were talking about the budget before the break, is the fact that low interest rates have helped borrowers hugely, but savers have suffered. And obviously, an increase in the Bank of England rate, it went up for the first time in years last month, is bad news for savers.
But not a lot, to be fair.
But not a lot, to be fair. But could be seen as good news for savers and not bad news for borrowers. Now, I assume that is part of a wider campaign to increase competition between banks and to sort of try and force them to be a bit more responsive on these occasions. But as you say, it was a relatively small rise,
0.25%
and
increase.
it's not at all clear it's going to lead to much bigger rises in the next few months.
And
with
not
so
necessarily
much...
bigger savings rates either, to be fair.
No, but
It's
clearly,
just 0.25%.
there is an argument, and obviously the Mail must be interested in it, because it's quite an unusual splash with so many other things around
and a budget.
in trying to generate more competition between banks by getting people to move around. So I assume it's a combination of their interest in the theme and that single quote from John Cunliffe, I think it is.
And meanwhile, the embattled, to use that journalistic phrase, Frau Merkel, cheer up, the paper says. Britain will soon be out of your hair. She, of course, cannot form a coalition and has got the prospect of another set of elections after Christmas, takes us to the Financial Times. Brussels and London aiming to reach a Brexit divorce deal within 3 weeks. Takes you back to the extra money you suggested at the beginning of our programme.
Yes. If you're a Brexiteer, this is good news, I suppose, that we're going to be moving on to the next phase of negotiations. Theresa May is going to have dinner with Jean-Claude Juncker at the beginning of December on the 4th, and apparently then she will be putting forward our offer and we'll be moving forward. You
make it sound so straightforward.
I know, exactly. It's obviously not. Obviously, the Irish border issue is a massively difficult one, which hasn't been resolved yet. I think it's still chaos behind the scenes.
So the question, have we got anywhere near the supposed 53 billion that the European Union wants us to pay, isn't it? We still don't know that.
The build-up to this summit, this is going to fill front pages between now and then. And she must be fairly confident that the money she has now agreed to offer them is going to be the breakthrough, because she wouldn't have raised the stakes by persuading Boris Johnson and Michael Gove at that cabinet committee last night to agree to this if she hadn't been briefed fairly authoritatively that it was going to be a kind of breakthrough there. But the FT, as well as being confident in terms of its headline, also points out the Irish border remains a volatile issue, so they've got huge, complex negotiations, I bet, around the clock between now and the summit next month. It's not just the payment, but the payment is fundamental. And I get a sense she is confident that this payment will get her through to the next round, which is, of course, even more complicated.
Yeah.
It's only a route through, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, it would be one thing if the 40 billion as is being reported was going to guarantee us a good deal, but obviously it's actually just an entry into a further round of discussions. So for those of us who are not Brexiteers, it seems like an awful lot of money for not very much.
Yeah. Let's move on, shall we? Up the top there, children having to attempt suicide, the story inside the Times says, to begin to access mental health care, which is really worrying if that is the case, isn't it?
Yeah, so statistics are suggesting that on average, mental health services in this country are turning away a quarter of children referred to them, and that in some cases the only way that they can actually receive the treatment they need is by attempting suicide or threatening suicide. This is the Children's Commissioner has warned this, which is obviously absolutely horrendous.
And the inside pages, Justin, very quickly, if you don't mind, on the budget. So there we are, the stock photograph of Philip Hammond at his desk, finishing off his
with
paper.
the red box.
Yes, we always love that.
And looking sort of earnest, but not too hopeful. They've got a sort of range of the kind of things. He might have a bit more money to spend from stamp duty and death tax money that's come in already. They've mentioned this schools aimed at plugging more cash for schools for numeracy, but that's the kind of incremental measure you get in most budgets and is not in itself hugely significant.
We'll talk more at 11:30, certainly. Now we've got some more details coming through. Polly Dunbar and Steve Richards, thank you both very much indeed. We'll see you later.
Thank you.
Let's check out the weather now.